There were three major holiday periods in the Jewish calendar, known as Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles. Passover corresponds to our Easter time, the middle of the first month of the Jewish year. Many Jews came up to Jerusalem for each of these three feasts, and they'd be in Jerusalem for up to 2 weeks, covering 5 days of preparation and 8 days of celebration. Several days before the actual Passover sacrifice, they had to select the lambs for the sacrifice. The second major time the Jews came up was the Feast of Pentecost, 7 weeks later. And then in autumn, in the 7th month, they had the Feast of Tabernacles. A large number of people were in Jerusalem at this Passover that John describes in chapter 2 and chapter 3 of his Gospel. Jesus had brought his disciples up to the temple and presented himself to the nation by cleansing the temple courtyard of those who bought and sold animals for sacrifice, and the money changers, and those who sold doves, driving them out of the courtyard with a whip of cords. The authorities, the Jews, said, "Who gave you authority to do this? What is the sign that you give us?" For the chief priest obviously approved of what was going on. His answer was, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." They did not understand his words. Their immediate reaction was, "It's taken 46 years to rebuild this temple, and can you do it in 3 days?" But Jesus didn't explain that he was speaking about the temple of his body, and they would execute him because of his zeal for God. But after 3 days he would rise again. And this saying remained in their minds and an enigma to them until after the resurrection, when these disciples remembered what he'd said and understood what he meant. But this was just one of the things that Jesus did in that time. We read at the end of chapter 2, "Now when he was in Jerusalem at the Passover during the feast, many believed in his name when they saw these signs which he did. But Jesus did not commit himself to them, because he knew all men, and had no need that anyone should testify of man, for he knew what was in man." There was a general expectation, fueled by John the Baptist, that Messiah was about to appear. So they were quick to identify Jesus as the Messiah when he took on the authorities of the temple by cleansing the temple. And whatever else he did, there were multiple signs that Jesus performed. Presumably he had begun his public ministry of healing and of teaching, and everyone was talking about him, and many people were sympathetic to him. But John explains Jesus was not relying on them. He was not rejoicing in the great following that he was amassing, because he had read Psalm 69, which tells that the people would reject him. He would become the song of the drunkards. So John says he had no need that anyone should testify of man, for he knew what was in man. But we continue in chapter 3 to read of the senior Pharisee, the teacher of the Jews, coming to Jesus at night to meet with him and to understand where he's coming from. Now there was a man of the Pharisees named Nicodemus, a ruler of the Jews. This man came to Jesus by night and said to him, "Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher come from God, for no man can do these signs that you do unless God is with him." Jesus answered and said to him, "Most assuredly I say to you, unless one is born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God." Nicodemus said to him, "How can a man be born when he is old? Can he enter a second time into his mother's womb and be born?" Jesus answered, "Most assuredly I say to you, unless one is born of water and the Spirit, he cannot enter the kingdom of God. That which is born of the flesh is flesh, and that which is born of the Spirit is spirit. Do not marvel that I said to you, you must be born again. The wind blows where it wishes, and you hear the sound of it, but you cannot tell where it comes from and where it goes. So is everyone who is born of the Spirit. Nicodemus answered and said to him, How can these things be? And Jesus answered and said to him, Are you the teacher of Israel, and do not know these things? Most assuredly I say to you, we speak what we know and testify what we have seen, and you do not receive our witness. If I have told you earthly things, and you do not believe, how will you believe if I tell you heavenly things? My name's Arthur, and I thank you for joining me as we consider chapter 3, verses 1 to 12 of John's Gospel. So who was this man? He was one of the Pharisees, a ruler of the Jews. That means he was a member of the Council of 70, known as the Sanhedrin. But Jesus also calls him the teacher of Israel. So at this time, he is the formal head of the Pharisees, the chief teacher. Not just a teacher, but the teacher of Israel. He comes privately to Jesus by night. He is respectful. Rabbi. He is impressed. We know that you are a teacher come from God, for no one can do these signs which you do unless God is with him. Now, this is all taking place at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, but obviously the works that Jesus is doing testify that he is someone who has come from God, a teacher from God, a prophet. And this will be a debating point for the Jews right through John's Gospel. But Nicodemus accepts this. Jesus didn't develop his teaching slowly through his public ministry, and the disciples didn't create it after Jesus rose from the dead. For John is telling us that Jesus lays down his teaching before the chief theologian in Jerusalem at the very beginning of his ministry. It was there from the beginning, for this is the beginning of his public ministry, and his immediate response to Nicodemus was, Most assuredly, I say to you, unless one is born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God. Throughout John's Gospel, we have Jesus making strong statements. In the King James, these statements were prefixed by verily, verily. In the New King James, it's most assuredly. Other translations have truly, truly. It's a phrase which is difficult to translate, but it essentially means this is a statement of critical importance which you need to take heed of. It has the absolute authority of heaven. And Jesus speaks, I say to you. He's not quoting somebody else, which is what the Pharisees typically said. He's not even quoting the Old Testament. He is making a new statement. Unless one is born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God. John already introduced in verse 12 of chapter 1 the fact that we could be born children of God. And this is the first time Jesus actually declares that in his ministry at the beginning. But Nicodemus doesn't understand. The only birth he knows is natural birth. And how can an old man enter into his mother's womb and be born again? He is completely perplexed. But Jesus is talking about a different kind of birth. So, most assuredly, truly, truly, verily, verily, I say to you, unless one is born of water and the Spirit, he cannot enter the kingdom of God. That which is born of the flesh is flesh, and that which is born of the Spirit is spirit. So do not marvel that I say to you, you must be born again. Now we have a clear distinction being made between the first birth, which is a natural birth, birth by water, birth into a natural body, part of this world, and the spiritual birth, which makes you a child of God, birth into the eternal realm, which is the kingdom of God, God's realm. This is a birth of the Spirit, and is necessary to participate in the kingdom of God.